Welcome to the Citizens Band Radio Hour. Thoughtful conversations that explore issues of media and journalism, democracy and citizenship. The Citizens Band Radio Hour is sponsored by the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. You can visit the center online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Here's your host, Coy Barefoot.
Nicole Hemmer is with the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, U.S. News and World Report as well. Her latest book, Messengers of the Right, which we have discussed on this program before. Nicole, welcome back to the program. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Coy.
So you recently gave a lecture at the University of Virginia. You explored the history of the alt-right, which for most Americans, this is a new phrase. It comes out of Europe. We're not used to alt-right or Antifa. These were European things, but now we use them in our headlines here in the States. Nicki, who are the alt-right? And help us understand the beliefs they represent in the context of the more traditional GOP and Republicans and American conservatism, movement conservatism, with which most of us are familiar, but there just seems to be this new radical right wing calling themselves the alt-right. Who are these people?
Most people hadn't really heard of the alt-right until August of 2016, but they've actually been around for about a decade longer than that. So they emerge in the mid-2000s. And as you can tell from their name, alt-right or alternative right, they position themselves as an alternative to traditional conservatism. And the alternative that they were offering was that they believed that American politics, the American right, needed to be much more rooted in what they saw as this civilizational struggle in which white people, particularly white men, were losing their hold on power, and that they should have that power, that they were being displaced by ideas like political correctness and by immigration and by a failure to properly fight the war on terror, and that if the American conservative movement could tack more toward those issues, that it would speak more directly to what America was really supposed to be, which was a land led by white men. That's kind of the idea behind this. And right from the start, people like Richard Spencer, who everyone at this point has probably heard of, was at the heart of this, was helping to coin these terms, was working at alternativeright.com. There were a bunch of other media homes for the alt-right. They were on the internet, but they were also places like something called Talkies Magazine. And then these older white nationalist and white supremacist sites, like a site called VDare and another one called American Renaissance. You know, they used to have these devout pages that were like, we are about the defense of the white race, and now they call themselves race realist or alt-right, and so they've kind of refashioned themselves to be part of this movement.
So can we connect the ideological dots between the John Birchers, say, of the late 50s and early 60s and the alt-right today, or are they two totally different things?
I mean, they're different in some ways and they're alike in some ways. So the John Birch Society had this hard conspiratorial edge. Its obsession was communism. That's not so much the obsession of the alt-right, but that kind of secretive conspiratorial side of things is fairly similar. The John Birch Society also, I mean, it could be difficult because communism was one of its primary obsessions. They were also anti-black. They were also pro-segregation, but that often didn't come to the forefront of what they were doing, at least before the mid-1960s. And those ideas about race are front and center when it comes to the alt-right. So the issues are different, but this idea of a group that starts off kind of on the fringe, kind of out of sight, and then moves into the spotlight, that is actually a pretty similar process. Because the John Birch Society had been around since 1958, and it's not until 1961 that journalists suddenly discover them and see them as the key to extremism on the right, and connect them pretty closely with the presidential campaign in 1964 of Barry Goldwater. And Goldwater is seen as kind of mainstreaming the John Birch Society, although unlike the current president, he distanced himself from those more extreme edges.
Yeah, which take a moment to talk about because that's so important. William Buckley, Goldwater, they stiff-armed the Birch Society, the extremists, the alt-right of their day back in 1964. They said, no, you're not one of us. You're not welcome here. You're not good for the party. You're not good for our beliefs, and we reject you. And so the Goldwater populism of 1964 rejects that right-wing extremists of the day. We haven't seen the Trump populists reject them. We've seen them embrace them.
Right, and I think this has a lot to do with the differences between the two presidential candidates in question, because, I mean, we still have a conservative movement that is working to distance itself from the alt-right. At the same time, just like, the National Review and Bill Buckley, they do reject the Birch Society in 1965. But before that, in the 1950s and early 1960s, there were some close ties. And there are some close ties between conservative media and the alt-right media. Now, I think those they're becoming different as more mainstream conservative media reject the alt-right. But there are some ties there, and that is a similarity. But I do think it matters quite a bit, the message that's coming from the top. And Barry Goldwater, he certainly played around with extremist politics. It was part of his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention in 1964, but he did try to keep them out of his campaign, and that is the big difference. Whereas Barry Goldwater rejected them, Donald Trump courted them and actually brought Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, Seb Gorka, and other people associated with the alt-right into first his campaign and then his presidency, and that is a tremendous difference because it emboldens rather than shunts aside these more extreme groups.
We're talking with Nicole Hemmer of the Miller Center of Public Affairs. Her book is Messengers of the Right, which is must reading for understanding the context for today's conservatism in America and the really, Nicki, would you agree, the sort of counter-revolutionary force that it has become?
Absolutely. And I think that, it's interesting. A project that I'm working on now about conservatism in the 1990s is I think the root of the word you use, counter-revolution, is quite right, that there becomes this sort of almost nihilistic thread within conservatism that leads to the more extreme and more breakneck politics that we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years coming out of the conservative movement, out of some Republicans in Congress, and then I think feed into somebody like Steve Bannon, who calls himself someone who's pushing for the deconstruction of the administrative state, by which he actually means the destruction of the administrative state and the government, and has this kind of burn it all down idea about government. Well, that's something that we also hear occasionally in Newt Gingrich's rhetoric back in the 1990s, and it's notable that Gingrich has been a pretty solid supporter of Donald Trump since the summer.
Help us understand the connections to Putin's Kremlin and the ideological circle that he has put himself in. He is supporting alt-right movements across Europe, in democracies around the world. He's, the argument goes that, and it's been reported that they're directly funding some of these efforts. The more radical right-wing movements in democracies, they help establish them. They help to give them credibility. They help give them some funding. And it's fascinating. And so you have the alt-right here in Charlottesville just a few months ago chanting, "Russia is our friend." Mm-hmm. As you point out, very different from the John Birchers of the 50s and 60s. How do we understand that? How can we explain this?
That's right. It's definitely very different from the Birch Society. They were not chanting, "Russia is our friend." I think that we can understand it both as strategic and ideological. Strategic because one of the things that Putin is interested in is destabilizing the governments of the West. So by promoting these groups that are fundamentally illiberal, he is doing that. He's helping to fund and bring radical politics into European and U.S. mainstream politics. So there's a strategy behind it, but there's also an ideology behind it, both a sort of white masculinity that Putin is actually quite supportive of, and that has a hold in Russian politics. White nationalism isn't exclusive to the United States, but also that illiberalism that I'm talking about, this anti-democratic strongman type of government, that's the kind of government that Putin is constructing in Russia, and he would like to see allies in Europe, in the United States. And so supporting those kind of illiberal regimes that won't criticize him for human rights abuses or for imprisoning people for political reasons or for cutting off the free press, and will in fact support him in those efforts and in building those sorts of governments. So there are a lot of reasons why Putin would be interested in supporting the alt-right and other extremist groups in these countries. And he's, as we've seen, having quite a bit of success.
Yeah, he is. They are having success, and if a lot of journalists are to be believed, they are really making efforts to fuel alt-right efforts in these democracies to help them in their effort to cause chaos, because Putin's going to benefit if the democracies of the world are in chaos.
Right, and I think that this is a good reminder of some things that countries did after World War II and during the Cold War, which is democracies become vulnerable when they're not well functioning. Right, so there are weaknesses, whether it is economic weaknesses, if there are people who feel like they're not able to make a living or get ahead or feel like they're losing out, if you have a chaotic media environment, if you have distrust in the government. It's those kinds of weaknesses within democratic governments that make them vulnerable to these sorts of things. So, yes, there needs to be efforts to sort of halt what Russia is doing. Yes, there need to be efforts to counter the illiberalism and the racism and the anti-woman politics and anti-Semitism of the alt-right. But there also needs to be efforts to shore up faith in democratic institutions and in democracy itself, because without that weakness, it would be much more difficult to destabilize, long-standing democratic governments by funding a few people on the internet.
Exactly. And I think attacking, as you say, the institutions of a democracy is so critically key to that. Attacking the very idea of government, attacking elections. Oh, they're all rigged. You can't believe them. Attacking a free press, as the founders would have said. Journalism, as it's all fake. You can't believe them. Attacking public education. It's all just politically correct brainwashing of children. We hear this constantly. And take a moment to share your thoughts about, we see that, Niki, in the movement conservatism that your book, Messengers of the Right, is about. They're attacking these institutions as well. But we also see it in the alt-right today.
Right, and I do think that this is a kind of through line, and one of the problems that conservatism has opened up that I don't think the conservative movement has answers for, because this kind of attack on institutions has been central to movement conservatism since the 1950s and 60s, this idea that you can't trust media. Media are all biased, and so conservatives need to seek out their own media and reject media that isn't conservative. This idea that government isn't the problem to your solutions, or government isn't the solution to your problems, government is the problem. And this lack of faith in, as you said, public schools, that they're liberal institutions, that they're brainwashing institutions. And the problem with this is, once people lose faith in the institutions of government, it's really difficult to have a well-functioning democracy. And so it weakens some of the very basic foundations of something that I think conservatives are quite interested in actually conserving, which are our free and democratic institutions. And I think particularly over the past 20 years or so, as conservative media have grown so much more powerful and so much more embedded within Republican politics themselves, it really has become a weaponized charge to talk about media bias, and it's become a reflexive one, and one that isn't necessarily very thoughtful. And so I do think that the alt-right has taken this a step further. I think that it matters, too, when you have a president who dismisses any sort of oppositional reporting as fake news and continues to work to tear down faith in media, faith in government, talk about the deep state, talking about rigged elections well in advance of the vote in 2016. So, Donald Trump has become a core part of the attack on institutions and on legitimate governance.
Niki, again, any other insights into how Americans today should understand the alt-right and maybe where they go next?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the missing pieces, something that I haven't talked about today that is often overlooked in discussions in the media of the alt-right, is how central anti-feminism is to their politics. And I think this is particularly important at this moment that we're talking about sexual assault and sexual harassment and Harvey Weinstein and all of these different things, that we also need to understand that the alt-right comes not just out of white nationalism, but it comes out of anti-feminist politics. There's this thing we won't get into, but this thing called Gamergate in 2013, 2014, where video gamers, white male video gamers, were attacking women journalists and women game developers because they felt that these women were bringing PC politics into video gaming, and it was no longer a sacred space. And that really was the entering wedge into alt-right politics for a number of young white men, this Gamergate phenomenon. And anti-women politics has been a core part of the alt-right from the very beginning and continues to be one of its more vicious parts that gets overlooked, I think, because there's actually still so much violence against women in our society that it's become so normalized that we don't even see it when the alt-right is doing it. And I think that matters, given that Donald Trump was running against a woman candidate. Another thing that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, the way that anti-feminism played into the 2016 election. And so I think that's an important thing for people to understand, particularly when thinking about where they go next. I mean, taking advantage of discontent among some men about the environment around sexual assault and sexual harassment, that's going to be another way of bringing more people into the alt-right movement, not necessarily through racist politics, but through anti-woman politics.
And I want to take a moment just to pull the camera way back here because we're talking about young, disaffected, marginalized, perhaps young white men. I see so many similarities between the kind of cultivation of these, of the members of this, for lack of a better word, this political movement, and ISIS, for example, or Al Qaeda. They go to these young men and say, "Your people, your soil, your country, everything that you identify as you and what you're about is under threat by forces that are so great that we must come together to defend everything that we love." And it has to do with religion. It has to do with skin color. It has to do with nationality. And it just strikes me that there's some eerie similarities between the young white man chanting in a Charlottesville park and the young Muslim man with a rifle in the Middle East.
Well, I think we need to call this what it is, which is a process of radicalization. This is something that at the event here at UVA a couple of weeks ago, Jamel Bowie talked about, and he has it precisely right. I mean, if we think about the process from this Gamergate phenomenon that I was talking about, Steve Bannon, who was working at Breitbart at the time, saw all of that anger and all of that energy and was looking for a way to turn that into political votes for the Republican Party, because he understood the problem of the Republican Party, which was that it relied increasingly on white voters, and white voters were less and less of the population. And so you need these energized non-voters to become voters. And he used that anger. He specifically targeted the people who were upset by that. He hires Milo Yiannopoulos, whose reputation came out of Gamergate, has him come on as the tech editor of Breitbart, and helps use Breitbart to bring these disaffected young white men, as you talk about, into the broader politics of the alt-right. And that is a process of radicalization. Just to give one more example, a white nationalist who was at Charlottesville who actually just got arrested for being involved in a shooting after Richard Spencer's appearance in the University of Florida, talks about how he came to the alt-right and to white nationalism. He hears that Spencer is speaking at Texas A&M University, and so he goes there and he meets other people like him. He meets other white nationalists, and he enters the movement that way, and he becomes radicalized by his contact both in person and online with other white nationalists. And we need to pay attention to this process of radicalization because that's what it is, and it has a body count, as we know.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the violence. One of my dear friends, Sean Kenny, who's on this program every week, he's the former director of the Republican Party of Virginia, and Sean is actually the one on this program many months ago. He broke the news about the alt-right rally because one of his friends sent him an email, and he said, and Sean, I should say, is no fan of the alt-right and thinks it's very bad for the GOP and for all the fundamental beliefs that he has. But I remember when this first came up months ago on this program, and Sean was looking at his phone and he said, hey, looks like these alt-right guys are going to be coming to Charlottesville in August. And he said, right then in that moment, he said, everybody that's listening to me now, please stay away. He said, these guys are really violent, and they're coming to look for a fight. It's what they do. They're not the KKK. They're not going to wave their flag and go home. They're going to come armed, looking to get into a fight. It's part of what they do when they rally, and we've certainly seen that wherever they gather.
Right. Confrontation is part of the tactics of the alt-right. Part of it is for media attention, but part of it is also, again, we're talking about disaffected young white men. Violence is part of the draw, right? This idea that you can get into a fight, that you can prove your manhood by these kinds of confrontations. And also, many of them came armed. And that, too, those signs of violence, those tools of violence, are not just part of how they intimidate and how they sort of exert their masculine violence in public, but they're also weapons that they would like to use if they come into conflict. And while the more recent appearance, I think sometime last month, the 15-minute appearance down in Emancipation Park where a dozen or so alt-right white nationalists showed up with torches, they were trying to counter that narrative because they realized the damage that it has done in many ways to be associated with murder. They want to make the argument that they're not the sources of conflict and confrontation, but that has long been part of what they're looking for and part of the appeal of being part of these groups is to act out this violence.
And in the same token, we also see on the left, the streets were full of counter-protesters, Nikki, who were also looking for a fight. And this is not to make some, as Trump did, it's not to make some moral equivalence like, oh, they're the same. I'm not saying that, but I am. But all you have to do is watch the videos of what was going on down there that day. And there were plenty of counter-protesters who were jumping into the street, pushing, shoving, hitting, swinging bats. There was a lot of that going on. And I guess the argument today is, well, they're Nazis, so it's okay. The assault, any assault on them is okay. I happen to disagree with that. I think assault is assault, but that's a fascinating angle to this story that I don't think has gotten enough attention.
Well, I think that we've given so much attention and spent so much time trying to unpack and to understand who the alt-right is, and there hasn't been that same kind of attention given to Antifa, which is the part of the group that you're talking about. And where I would argue there is not a moral equivalency is what they're fighting for. One is fighting for racism and one is fighting in opposition to fascism. But the argument behind anti-fascism, which the first Antifa groups come out of Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, they come to the United States shortly thereafter. They blend in the 1980s and 90s, anti-fascism and anti-racism. The argument behind them, they don't only use violence, but they see violence as a legitimate tool to stop a violent genocidal ideology. So the idea is that because we know where fascism goes when it gains power, that it is just and even moral to use violence to stop it when it's 10 people or 100 people so that it doesn't get to the point where it's a million people and you get mass murder and genocide as part of those regimes, since those things are seen as legitimate by fascist regimes. Now, whether one agrees with that argument or not, I think it's important that we understand that that's the argument, and we understand that we can reject or not reject the use of violence by either of these groups, but that they use the same tactics does not make them equivalent, because we also have to think about what ideologies they're defending or attacking.
Right. But we do sort of see a rationale to use force and violence against other human beings in the public square based on oppositional political beliefs. I guess that's the part that bothers me the most. It seems like
right.
The ideas, democratic ideals, are being assaulted by both sides in that regard.
Well, and I would say that the Antifa don't see themselves as, sort of small L liberal, right? They see themselves as a radical group, and so they reject the sort of norms of polite democratic society. They say that polite democratic society can't actually stop fascism, and so we need to. But I do think that you're right that it points to the state of our politics now, that violence is becoming more and more accepted and more normalized as a form of politics, even though we know that violence is actually the failure of politics, right? Once fists start flying, once guns start being fired, once war, whether it's a street war or a war between countries, breaks out, that's when politics has failed.
Nicole Hemmer is the author of Messengers of the Right. She's a scholar, historian, journalist. She's with the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and writes regularly for U.S. News and World Report. You can follow her on Twitter at Past Punditry. Niki, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of people who seem to believe here in Charlottesville, at least, with our local/international angle on this story, that they seem to believe that if we just took away the Confederate statues, the alt-right would disappear. And I think that really reveals a deep misunderstanding of the arguments the alt-right is making. The people who think that if you get rid of the statues, the alt-right won't want to come to Charlottesville, it's the opposite is true, because that will only prove their point. They're in the park saying you can't erase us, and they mean you can't take away the statues of our heroes, our white heroes. If those statues disappeared, they'd have all the more reason to come to Charlottesville, because it would prove their point that there are forces trying to erase what they believe is their noble history.
The statues were a convenient issue for the alt-right. They latched onto the statues because they saw them both as a cause that other people were rallying around, so it is a way to, again, radicalize more people, but also because taking the statues down is going to be interpreted by the alt-right and other white nationalists as a sign that, in fact, they're right, that the politically correct culture that we're in is working to destroy the history of white people, and that white people no longer have a say in the stories that are being told. In fact, they're being ripped out of the landscape altogether. Now, this is a pretty flawed interpretation, but that doesn't matter for its political uses. And so taking down the statues, which I personally think is, especially in light of the violence in Charlottesville, is a good thing to do, is not going to be interpreted as a death knell for the alt-right, and in fact is not going to make Charlottesville a place that they stop coming to. I mean, now Charlottesville has been turned into a battlefield for the alt-right. Richard Spencer, as we all know, has long ties to the area, and so it seems likely, we can't predict the future, but it seems quite likely, statues or no, that the alt-right will be back.
Let me ask you this, and again, to reflect on your scholarship with the history of the Goldwater era in the early 60s, there were a lot of Americans who were surprised to learn that there were so many people who supported Goldwater and his what was seen at the time as sort of a radical right-wing populism. But it turned out there were a lot of Americans who were ideologically in that corner with Goldwater. What's your read on the extent to which Americans support the alt-right, or maybe they might say in a poll, "Oh no, I wouldn't vote for them." But when you get behind that curtain in the voting booth, they actually do agree with the alt-right on a lot of these issues.
Well, I think it depends on what we mean when we say agree with the alt-right. I think that when it comes to this kind of hardcore alt-right, white nationalist, racism, hardcore anti-women politics, the waving of Nazi flags and Confederate flags, I think that sort of iteration of the alt-right that we saw here in Charlottesville, I don't think most Americans look at that and say, that's what I want my future to look like. That said, the sort of softer edge or the easier to enter into arguments of the alt-right, I think do hold attraction for lots of Americans, particularly lots of white Americans, not exclusively men, not exclusively white. But if you think about antagonism towards what people see as politically correct culture, that's something that the alt-right can use as a bridge into harder alt-right philosophies. Because, I mean, this is a fight that we've been having since the 1990s, that American culture, American politics have gotten too politically correct, that women and minorities have gotten too much power. And what we see in something like with the election of Donald Trump is that even if many Americans wouldn't necessarily sign on to a mission statement for the alt-right, it doesn't bother them as much as we like to tell ourselves it would bother them. One of the things we saw with the candidacy of Donald Trump is that a person can be overtly racist, anti-woman, and people can kind of bracket that and can vote for him anyway and want to see him in power. And so I think that one of the lessons of the 2016 election and of everything that's happened this year is that not that white Americans in particular, are across the board supportive of the alt-right, but perhaps that ideas like white nationalism and patriarchy and all of these things are still pretty acceptable in ways that some people thought that they weren't anymore.
And that's the part that gets me. That's the part that mystifies me the most. You know, here we are in 2017 in the first quarter of the 21st century, and yet we're still struggling in America. In a democracy, we're still struggling against racism, anti-Semitism, anti-woman, this really parochialism, ignorance, willful ignorance. It seems like it's always been there. And you know, once upon a time, the founders said, hey, the key is public education and a strong press. We need to educate the citizenry. We need to give them the facts of the day, and they will be enlightened. And they'll choose the right course of action. And I guess by that, Jefferson and Madison meant they will choose to reify and endorse democratic ideals. And the democracy this sort of nascent democracy of the 18th century, they hoped that it would grow stronger. And it has. I mean, you've got founding, successive generations of founders who give us things like the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and they're constantly having to push back against ignorant nativism and parochialism. And here we are in the 21st century still struggling against it.
Right, and I guess I would say a couple of things. One, I think for people who experience racism, this is not as surprising. I think that there was a primarily white liberal fantasy that the election of Barack Obama ended racism, which is an absolutely crazy idea to anyone who actually experiences racism, because it didn't go away. In fact, there was a huge backlash. You could even say that the election of Donald Trump is part of that backlash. The rise of the alt-right is part of that backlash against that sort of racial progress. And in fact, these two things have gone hand in hand since the founding, that any sort of racial progress is immediately met with racist progress. I mean, you mentioned the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments that end slavery and make black men citizens and give black men the right to vote. And then what happens? It's immediately followed by an era of Jim Crow violence that is about making those rights inoperative. right? When the civil rights movement begins to pick up speed in the 1950s and 1960s, it's followed first by massive resistance in the South and then by the Southern strategy, which nationalizes that Southern racism within the Republican Party. And so it should not come as a surprise that white nationalism continues to have a hold on American politics, or that racial progress would be met by racist progress. But we do like to tell ourselves progressive fairy tales about how education will wipe out racism. I mean, the founders were really educated. They also owned slaves.
Yes,
so
indeed.
I think that we fantasize about what racism is, and we think that it's a function of ignorance, when often it's a function of rational self-interest, especially if you're white.
Nicole Hemmer is with the Miller Center for Public Affairs, and her must-read new book is Messengers of the Right. You can follow her on Twitter at Past Punditry. Nicki, it's always a pleasure to have you on this program. You're so generous with your time and your expertise, and I can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having me, Coy. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Citizens Band Radio Hour, a production of the Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Archived podcasts are available online at mediaandcitizenship.org. The executive producers for the program are Siva Vaidyanathan and Coy Barefoot.